Good evening, everybody. My name is Patrick Fisher, and I'm the Executive Director of Erie Arts and Culture. I want to thank you for joining us once again for another Pro Network session. Our Pro Network sessions are intended to provide real-world knowledge shared with professionals from throughout the world, with creatives and cultural professionals in our community about best practices and how to navigate the ecosystem of the creative and cultural sector. So I want to thank you all for joining us, whether you're watching with us via Zoom, Facebook Live, or YouTube. The Pro Network is a program by Erie Arts and Culture out of Erie, Pennsylvania, and it is funded in part by the National Endowment for the Arts through their Artworks program. We're extremely appreciative of that support. This evening, we are joined with two individuals, Molly Marinkik and Jeremy Stoller from Beehive Dramaturgy. Beehive Dramaturgy Studio was founded in 2016 by Molly Marinkik, Natasha Sinha, and Jeremy Stoller to make skilled dramaturgy accessible to producers and individual artists through a range of affordable collaborative offerings. Organizational partners have included Anti-Capitalism for Artists, page 73, Playwrights Realm, Yale Indigenous Performing Arts Program, Wingspace, among others. The co-founders are artistic associates at Musical Theater Factory and received the inaugural 2019 MTF Builders Award. Individually, Beehive Dramaturgs have worked with Cesar Alvarez and Emily Orling, L.M. Feldman, Gina Familia, Dave Harris, Zora Howard, Michael R. Jackson, Melissa Lee, and Kit Yan, Heather Raffo, and many other generative artists. For information on services and all 18 Beehive Dramaturgs, please visit beehivedramaturgy.com. Molly and Jeremy, I thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having us. We're thrilled to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I'm just working to get our presentation up. Give me just one moment. And putting us in presenter mode. Great, take it away, Molly.
Well, thank you for being here and for listening to this little presentation. My name is Molly Marinkik, and I am located in the New York, New Jersey area. I am a dramaturg. I do a lot of freelance work for various organizations, and I also work at McCarter Theater Center in Princeton, New Jersey.
And I am Jeremy Stoller, also in the New York, New Jersey area. In addition to co-founding Beehive, I'm also the director of new work at Keen Company, in addition to doing a bunch of freelance work. Just want to say right now, if you see me looking away from my screen, it's just because I have a separate screen with some of our notes for the presentation that we're sharing today. And again, thanks to Patrick for having us, and just want to credit our other co-founder, Natasha Sinha, who's not with us tonight, but is also responsible for building our ethos for giving and receiving feedback. So what is Beehive Dramaturgy Studio? Patrick read our bio, which tells sort of what we're doing. And we just want to say a little bit about sort of why we're doing it. We're this arts service organization that was founded to make skilled dramaturgy available to any playwright, director, composer, producer, or other theater practitioner, sometimes arts practitioners outside theater, who wish to add a dramaturg to their process. We were all working as dramaturgs in literary positions at theaters in New York, and we often found ourselves talking to artists who didn't really know how they might engage with the dramaturg, but were interested in the kind of services that a dramaturg offers. So we just set out to make that process easier and more transparent, and this collective was our way of doing that.
And dramaturgy itself is a term that is kind of ever-changing, and everyone has a bit of a different explanation. And anytime dramaturgy is used, it often takes on a life of its own based on what the project needs. So it was no small feat to put together our working definition of dramaturgy, but the way that we like to define it is dramaturgy is an exploration of the world suggested by the piece of art, both its imagined world of the artwork and its engagement with the world in which we live. We also want to note that we often talk about text when we talk about the art, but we know that storytelling comes in a variety of methods and forms. And so when we talk about dramaturgy, though we come from the theater world, we're not always talking specifically about theater. Dramaturgy exists in all the storytelling that is out there in the world.
Right. So just a note about that. So we come from this theater background, and we know that some of you who are attending indicated that you're having feedback discussions in other contexts. So whenever possible, we've tried to ensure that the language that we use in this presentation is broadly applicable. So we'll talk about like project instead of play, or artist instead of playwright. But if we slip a little bit into theater jargon, hopefully these notions are overall applicable, and there is a moment, there will be time for you to ask questions that are maybe pertinent to your more specific collaborative contexts.
So let's get into it and talk about what we say when we, or what we mean when we say feedback. So feedback in this context is the process by which an observer articulates their experience of a work directly to the artist, so as to support them in their process in the formulation of the piece the artist wants to make. And we want to just sort of call out that in feedback, there are two people involved, right? There's the artist, there's the person who has created the thing that the feedback is referencing. And then there's the observer, or the person who is providing that feedback. Always two people involved in this situation. So what does supportive feedback look like? So supportive feedback is when feedback is communicated well, and it means that the artist can use the experience to learn about how others are receiving their work. And what this might look like is it might confirm things that the artist was hoping for, it might shed new light on the work that the artist wasn't expecting, and it might help answer an outstanding question that the artist was wondering. So my previous comment about feedback involving two people, we can also say that when feedback is supportive, it's really centering the artist's needs.
And so in this session, we're gonna talk about strategies for both the person who's giving feedback and the person who's receiving it. Why? Well, we find that there's as much skill and care involved on both sides, both for being the person voicing the feedback to an artist. But we've also worked with a lot of artists who maybe didn't realize that they could and were completely entitled to take control of a feedback process about their work. We know some of you mentioned that you're particularly working with young artists, whether those are students or just people entering a field. And so they might, those artists, or some of you might be those artists here who are still figuring out what you need from others. And so wanted to offer guidelines for that as well. So as much as you want to ensure that artists only receive supportive, carefully phrased feedback from people who are sensitive to your needs, there will always be occasions where that isn't the case. So we wanted to address ways for those artists in that moment to know how to really take charge of what that process looks like. So first we'll talk about how we think of feedback. There will be, and both giving and receiving generally, and there will be chances to chat throughout, and then we'll also leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A.
So we've tried to think about the various types of scenarios where one might encounter feedback, because the rules of engagement can be a little different depending on the context. We came up with 4 that feel pretty prevalent. So feedback takes place when you're doing a one-on-one consultation, which might be something very formal, or it might be, having a drink with a friend and them responding to what they've just experienced in your work. It could be ongoing artistic collaborations where you know the people involved and there's already trust. It could be a writer's group, an artist workshop, a gathering of artists with some, stated and official goals. And in those circumstances, there might be lots of voices in the room. Some might be familiar to you, some might be new. And then everyone's favorite talkbacks with audiences, where anything can happen. We're wondering the other places that you might encounter feedback. And if anyone wants to put that in the chat or put it, write it on the Facebook page, let us know and we can add that. Later we'll discuss some other places that feedback comes up, because we know this is a non-exhaustive list.
Apologies. Great. So anything popping up in the chat? Should we pause, Jade or Patrick, or keep going? Great,
Nothing in the chat.
Okay, great, let's keep going then. So broadly speaking, any feedback session could always start with the artist asking themselves, what do I need right now, and then voicing it. And if you're the responder, starting this feedback session, nearly no matter what the context, what would be helpful for you right now? The artist may not know the answer to that question. You may have asked them before if you're ongoing collaborators, but simply the act of asking them, what would be helpful for you right now, starts the conversation off on a positive foot, indicates that you're someone who's really interested in being helpful, so that maybe there'll be a hiccup along the way, maybe something will get said that's misunderstood, but this just starts the conversation off from a way of orienting yourself towards supporting an artist, trusting an artist to be in charge of their piece and know what they want to make. We also want to acknowledge then at some points that everyone will be in both positions. At some point, everyone will be in a position to ask for feedback. Everyone will be in a position to receive it. So these tools and these modes are maybe useful for all of us to think about.
So we'll dive into some general tips now for giving feedback. We'll start there, and then we'll talk about receiving feedback in a moment. So after we cover sort of some general tips, we'll get into more specific context, the ones that we mentioned previously. So we'll start with giving feedback, which can be a tricky thing to navigate depending on how you as an individual responded to the work and what your relationship is to the artist. Two things that can be very different in very different situations. There are ways to decentralize yourself in the conversation as that person giving the feedback, and to truly use the opportunity to reflect back to the artist what will be most useful to their process. So if you can own these tips, you can have many fruitful conversations that really focus what the artist needs. So to begin, we like to say you can focus on your personal response. This is a sort of neutral way that lets you give the artist some feedback that no one else is able to provide for them, because this is coming from your subjective experience. So you could say things like, I really enjoyed something. I was most interested in something about the piece. I was confused about something. The piece left me feeling or thinking. So giving basic information about how you observed it, whether you're talking about story, themes, central characters, what questions you felt the piece was inviting you to wrestle with, it can let the artist know whether they are on the right track, whether your response is what they were expecting it to be. We also want to mention that you don't have to qualify why you felt this way. You might also find yourself just wanting to communicate what stood out to you, which could, sometimes not even be a very fully formed thought. Like you might say, wow, that particular moment was so shocking, I'm still thinking about it. Or I felt myself get emotional in this other moment. Sometimes just reflecting back what you experienced can let the artist know what's really sticking with you and what you're still thinking about after you finished observing the piece. So when you are giving your personal response, we want to encourage everyone to that it's often better to be shorter in your responses rather than long-winded, and this will come up again shortly.
So another strategy for giving feedback is offering neutral and open-ended questions, such as, and this is play-focused, has your character ever thought about this idea or action before? Or is this the first time it's coming up in their mind? Or what happened before this scene we're observing? Or, more broadly applicable to all of the arts, how do you want the audience or viewer to feel in this moment? So often you'll have a gut response to a piece, and that gut response might be the first thing that you want to share. We think that some of the obligation of being the person giving feedback is to try to get to the root cause of that response. And if you can sort of dial back to, like, what is the question? What's a question you could ask about that moment that might offer you an opportunity to have a conversation? And then once the artist tells you, oh, I don't know what I was doing with that moment, or actually, I know I really want the audience to feel rage after this piece, that offers a way back to that first tip about personal response. Oh, I did feel rage. Or actually, I didn't feel rage, I felt hope. And you know what I mean? And that builds an opportunity for you to have a conversation with the artist, and for the artist to really get that helpful feedback that we're aiming for.
So then another helpful tip that we like to always think about is why it's important to avoid prescriptive feedback. Prescriptive feedback basically tells an artist how to fix, solve, or change an aspect of their artwork. Prescriptive coming from the Latin word meaning to ordain, to write before, to determine in advance. So an example of this is, you see a workshop of a play and you tell the playwright afterwards, your protagonist should really fall in love with her boss and marry him at the end of Act 2. So this can be hurtful to an artist's process at worst, and it tends to not be directly useful at best. So if you think about it as any critique that starts with you could, should, didn't, or the piece is, does, doesn't, can, it can be flipped around to what you experienced as the observer, and then you can avoid prescriptive feedback. And so this is a natural follow-up to why I previously suggested that when you give feedback, you don't need to explain why you felt a certain way, because when we start to get specific about our personal reactions and then we center ourselves in that process, we can fall into the prescriptive feedback trap without even trying to, just by way of trying to explain to someone what we're thinking. So here's an example of that. So I felt really surprised in this moment. And then I guess I just didn't really want to feel surprised yet because I was hoping to learn more about the characters before then. So maybe you should wait until later to include that reveal, right? So that response starts as a neutral comment. I felt really surprised in this moment, which could be a helpful thing for an artist to hear. But then in the process of explaining why you felt surprised, it travels into prescriptive territory that might actually not be so helpful or might actually be a little confusing.
Right, to Molly's point, you can always give the artist the opportunity to ask more or to decide to move on. So now we're going to talk about some strategies for artists who will be receiving feedback. And again, these general principles will apply to multiple scenarios, we believe. And then after this, we'll sort of dive back into maybe some more specific contexts. So this first idea, and this is kind of the flip side of what we said before for people who are giving feedback, to ask sort of what are the parameters of the discussion, what do you need right now, to find the parameters of what you want this conversation to be. What the observer experiences might not encompass, so the observer is going to have their experiences that they want to talk about or things that are sticking out in their mind right now. But that might not necessarily be where you are in your process at this moment. So it's actually, any feedback process is presumably designed for the artist to be helpful to you. So set your boundaries here for what would be helpful to you and communicate them to the extent that you know what those are. So for example, and this is play specific language, but could be adapted. I'm not interested in feedback about scene 4. I'm considering 2 choices for my character here and need to figure it out myself before outside thoughts will be useful. Or I'm not looking about responses to the end of the work right now, right? That might have just been sketched in at the last minute, and maybe you spent much more time on the opening. And so the opening is the thing that you're actually like, oh, this is the piece I want the most feedback about. Or I'm curious if you liked the best friend character and felt that he was familiar and truthful, but I'm not looking for your response to his relationship with the protagonist. That's something I'm still working out, right? So these are just some different ways to let whoever you're chatting with know where the conversation could go. And then, if it ever drifts, you could say, actually, that's a little far away from what I was looking for, and you can help guide it back.
So in terms of what Jeremy was talking about with setting boundaries, you can also sort of take the lead on asking specific questions. So as the artist who has created the work, you know what you need. So you can put those questions out there and then ask for direct responses to the things that will be most useful to you in this development process that you're in the middle of. So you could say, what was your response to the juxtaposition of tragedy and comedy? What thematic ideas do you think the piece was attempting to convey? Did you see the ending coming? Were you bored at all? And if so, where? These can be big questions. These can be specific questions. These can be very granular. These can be experiential. They can be about the details of the work. But you as the person receiving the feedback in this relationship have the opportunity to shape what kind of feedback you receive. And we strongly encourage artists to proceed in that way.
And we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but depending on the context you're in, it can be more or less helpful to reveal what you're aiming for. So sometimes with a group of artists, say, who are also working in your field, it can be helpful to say, actually, I'm aiming more toward this one thing, and then ask the question. Sometimes with general audiences, that's less useful, but we'll dive into that more later. So especially in the early development stages, you may get feedback that really surprises you. Someone sees something in the work that seems totally outlandish to you. It can be easy to want to dismiss that comment of like, oh, this is just a one-off. No one else will feel that way. This person's an outlier, right? But I think what's useful is to listen for subtext or like the note behind the note, right? Not everything that a general audience member says might be well phrased or articulate. They might not know much about the art form from a professional point of view, but presumably they're representative of some segment of the audience, of an audience that will also feel as they did. So trying to figure out like, oh, they told me, maybe this audience member gave you the prescriptive feedback that you know you didn't want. And like that prescriptive feedback wasn't useful, but it might be worthwhile to try to think about, oh, but like, what was the thing they were really saying? Were they saying they were bored? Were they saying they were confused? So they might say something like, I was confused about why the brother leaves for his trip when the family is in crisis. And so maybe they just didn't catch the explanation for why which you so thoughtfully planted 2 scenes earlier. Or maybe that scene just has too much competing content that gets in the way of that crucial piece of information landing the way it needs to. So you might need to do a little digging for the subtext, but it can be worthwhile to assume that if at least one person feels that way, more people might feel that way.
So then taking and letting go of notes is something that can be really challenging, especially when you as the artist are in such a vulnerable situation. And we know that no matter how many parameters you have set, you will still sometimes receive unhelpful notes. It comes with the territory. So it can be helpful to decide in advance how you'd like to respond. And depending on the context is like, for example, is this someone you'll be working with again? Or is this someone you already know? Or is this environment conducive to more discussion or not? Sometimes the easiest response to a terrible note is simply to say thank you and then ignore the feedback. And I think it's also useful to remind yourself when entering into a feedback session as the artist that there will likely be some notes and comments that are not useful. And so prepare yourself that there will be a wide range of what comes your way, and to sort of anticipate that there will be some work on your part to figure out what feels meaningful and what doesn't.
Right. Sometimes I've been facilitating a talk back and the artist is there with their notepad diligently writing what appears to be every comment, and sometimes look at a bad comment and what they'll write in their notebook is like bad comment with the frowny face, like, and then it's done and then you let it go. Okay, so now we're gonna go back to some of those specific scenarios we discussed earlier, because certain things about giving and receiving feedback can be different, a little different in each context. So first we're gonna talk about one-on-one consultations. So usually this consultation is between artists and someone they trust, either someone the artist has engaged to give feedback, or perhaps the person giving feedback is someone who has engaged the artist for a project or a contract or whatever it might be. So tips for giving feedback in a one-on-one consultation. So first off, try to get as much context as possible. How experienced is the artist you're working with, and how experienced are they in this form that they're working in here? Is this the first time they've worked in this form, or have they been doing it for a long time? How long have they been working on this specific piece? Is it a first draft? Is it something that's been in their mind for years? How is it a departure from or an outgrowth of their earlier work? I always write autobiographical pieces, and now I'm suddenly expanding to a historical drama. Or I always choreograph ballet, and now I'm choreographing tap. This is a novel, and I am a novelist. I've been writing novels for decades, right? It can be any of those things. And all of that will be useful for you to think about how you're pitching your feedback. Where did the idea come from, right? What was that first seed? Was it something they saw on the news? Was it a personal story from their family? Was it a mix of, did they dream it, right? All of these things help you to understand sort of like what that first seed was, and that can be a great place to sort of launch your conversation. You might want to know, have they received feedback on this, or have they shared it with an audience yet? Knowing, are you the first person they're sharing with this with, and is that particularly vulnerable? Or has it been through a lot of rounds of feedback, and sort of like, how did that feedback change it? All of that, you're trying to figure out the journey, because you're joining this artist on a journey, right? And so learning as much about that journey as possible will just help the conversation you're about to have. And then often what's useful is a conversation, what other artists does this artist consider an influence on their work in general, or this specific piece? Knowing that you both have in common a love of a certain painter or poet or movie director, right? Or knowing that this artist considers themselves in conversation with this other person, either maybe that'll help you see the piece in a new way, maybe you won't see that at all. That can all be really useful to you in sort of knowing how to start this conversation. So then if you're the artist, if you're receiving feedback, hopefully the person giving the feedback will know to ask for all of this context, but they might not. So if you can provide this context to them, even if they don't ask, this is going to help bring them again into this journey with you. You want to invite them into the process, and this will help ensure that the conversation you're about to have is sort of going to as immediately get into this good groove as it can. So then also just to say, feel free to voice when something isn't necessarily helpful to you, or maybe you've had enough feedback in the session. Sometimes the person giving feedback might have more to say than you're prepared to hear in a moment. So, and often they don't have experience generating art. So they might not be thinking, oh, like, this is just a lot to think about right now. This actually gives me enough to work on for the next few months, right? So no one to say that. And then again, if you're giving feedback to someone who's new at the process, note that they might not feel comfortable or confident to voice that, especially if you're working with student artists who are just entering the field. So be sensitive to, if you can, to when the session might have gone on for long enough, when you've hit the sort of most salient points and maybe given them enough to think about for a little while.
So now we'll talk about ongoing artistic collaborations. And this could be, for example, a rehearsal process, or it could be people who are part of the same team. And so they each have their own role in the team, but they've been interacting together over some length of time. So if you're the person giving feedback, and you know the person, you know the artist that you're working with, and that you're responding to their work, it's always helpful to ask them what would be helpful for you right now, because on this particular day, at this particular time, at this particular moment in the developmental process, it could be very different than, you know, the past conversation that the two of you had, whether it was the day before or the year before. So check in with them and ask what the artist is looking for right in that moment, and that will help guide how you can be most helpful with your feedback. It can be great to start with positives and to reiterate what you love and respond to about the piece, because that sort of sets up the conversation in a way that invites further conversation. Sometimes we want to go to the thing that sticks out to us, which may or may not be critical on some level, but by reinforcing the positives, it puts everyone on the same page and sort of sets everyone out ready to hear, ready to listen to whatever else is going to happen in the conversation. And then check in regularly, build in opportunities for these check-ins. So pre-planning sessions, postmortems, put a date on your calendar when you can get coffee and talk about it, but make it a point to habitualize these kinds of conversations, and then it will feel like a part of the process, and anyone involved can be more familiar and therefore more open to that conversation. And then if you are the artist receiving feedback from someone that you've worked with for a long time or that you are in collaboration with, it can be important to just remind yourself to keep setting, reiterating, redefining parameters and boundaries, because like I just said, like the day or the particular moment in the development process can and will change, and being aware of that and being responsive to that will allow you to move dynamically along with the process and ask for what you need based on what you are experiencing in that exact moment.
Great. So another context is, we're calling this writers groups, but really any kind of workshop setting where a group of artists who are usually in the same discipline meet regularly to share work in progress with each other. So they might all be writers or all composers or all choreographers, etc. And so again, starting here with giving feedback, what would be helpful to you right now is sort of the magic opening question. You want to give the writer or the artist the option to facilitate the conversation themselves or let a group moderator do it. The option should also exist for the writer or other generative artists to share their work or hear it out loud and not accept feedback. Maybe simply they needed the deadline of the group to share and aren't ready to hear something. Or maybe they learned everything they needed to by watching it and that's enough for them, right? So that always asking that question, always sort of building in the opportunity of is the thing that about to happen going to be useful to you? Should never be taken for granted, should always be sort of explicitly outlined. And just the act of that check-in, again, can just help really set up that conversation in a much warmer and more supportive way. And again, start with the positives, right? For all the reasons we said, let people know that you understand what they're trying to do so that when you have a critique, they know you're on the same page. And remind them, they might have been working on this piece for years. Maybe at this moment, nothing seems positive to them. Remind them, what is the thing that resonates, right? Don't take for granted that they know that already, or that they know you're supportive, right? Always starting with the positives is just, it's the necessary sort of hug that allows the difficult conversation that might be coming up to happen. So the artist should feel free to share where they're at in the process and where it's headed. This can help get peers on board with that journey and not confuse it with the piece that they would be making, right? So giving feedback, you want to be sensitive as an artist to oh, I work in this mode, or I am most concerned with this. Make sure that you're really giving the feedback that's helpful to this artist and not accidentally sort of making your own piece for them. So again, with receiving feedback, just keep setting, reiterating, redefining those parameters and boundaries. I just want to flag this. If an artist has expressed that they are having trouble with the part of the piece and you feel, sorry, this is also in the giving feedback section. It's in the, I think it's in the, it migrated to the wrong column. So if an artist has expressed that they're having trouble with the part of the piece and you have a valuable suggestion, if you have this piece of prescriptive feedback that you really think might be helpful, and you've maybe been in this group for a while, feel free to ask, are you open to suggestions about that, right? Don't just give the prescriptive feedback, but ask, would suggestions be helpful to you? They might say yes, at which point offer that feedback, and maybe that will be something that's key to them. But again, always take that little step beforehand to check in. Is this idea, is this going to be helpful for you? And trust the artist to know the answer to that.
So then with audience talkbacks, people who have paid money or at least given their time to check out some art, whether it's completed or whether it's in process, they're being asked about their impressions, and hopefully there is the explicit goal of supporting the artist. We assume that they understand that that is where their comments should be directed. So if you are at an audience talkback and you are giving talkback, the question still stands, what would be helpful for you right now? Because the artist is still at a certain point in their creative journey with the piece. And the option should exist for artists to share work or hear it out loud and not accept feedback. So just because a talkback is happening, be cognizant of the fact that it might not be the artist's choice or the artist's determination that that talkback is following the work. It might be the organization wants to have it, or it's good for the audiences, or there might be other factors at play. So being aware that the artist has not necessarily chosen to participate in that sort of leverages the experience that the artist can get out of this conversation. And then if you're the artist and you are at an audience talkback, it's useful to contextualize the artistic process for the audience. You don't need to discuss the background or the goals of the specific piece, but maybe there is something that you can share that will help set them up to give you the feedback that you're looking for. And then it can be worthwhile to trust that everyone who engages with the show or with the work has a valuable perspective on it, and to assume that you will have to do some detective work to find that value because they might not be able to articulate or share in as clear a way as what they are thinking and feeling after experiencing it. So we know that prescriptive feedback often misses the mark, but it comes out of some sort of feeling or impulse from the person sharing it. And sometimes that is worth sussing out where that comes from.
Great. Now, we just want to see if there's other specific scenarios you've encountered feedback that feel different in some way from the ones we've outlined. And then maybe we can talk about some tips for how that might go, or you can share some suggestions for how it's gone well or what hasn't gone well, and we can talk about that. And then after that, we'll open up for more general questions. But for now, are there any scenarios for giving, other scenarios for giving and receiving feedback that you've encountered or that you know that you will be encountering soon that you'd like to chat about? And maybe Jade and Patrick, you can help us monitor chat or hand raises. And we'll pause for just a moment.
We have a small but dedicated audience this evening, so we're only looking at 2 folks for potential input right now. There's no comments on Facebook at this time.
Okay. In that case, we can leave it open for Q&A and discussion if the 2 folks who are here want to share anything about sort of what part of the arts you're coming from or collaboration, and if there's any way maybe we can help you brainstorm, we'd be really happy to do that. But I also know sometimes you show up for a webinar not planning to speak, and that's okay too.
So Vanessa typed a question or a general statement into the chat function, which says sometimes have to give feedback to student theater work when they don't have specific questions. Any thoughts on how to give feedback when a specific question isn't necessarily being asked, or how to perhaps mine a specific question out of somebody?
Well, with students, in my experience, there is great value in the opportunity for someone to be nurtured as they learn who they are as an artist, and the comfort of being in a class environment or knowing that you're a student and knowing that you're identified in that way sort of gives a little bit of license to maybe be a little bit less structured in the discovery process. So I think feedback can in many ways help a student sort of learn a little bit more about who they are. And so if a student doesn't have a specific question, often what I have found useful is to ask them about the process and ask them about their impulses and their choices in creating the work, because often that will lead me to some more tangible questions that they might not know how to articulate, but that really speak to who they are as an artist and what they're actually trying to do with the piece. If you can get them talking about those impulses, things might come up that then lead you to further conversation.
Yeah, and maybe what I would add to that, I love all of that you said, Molly, is back to that idea of observations, just affirming that you've seen what they've made, that you found, oh, I see this message in here, right? Or this was so funny, or so I see, you know, affirming for them that the thing that they've created has reached you in some way. Just observations about like, oh, this is really an adventure story, right? Anything like that, as basic as the observation might seem, delivered with some sort of real admiration that they've told a story, that they've communicated something, can be great. And I guess, you know, depending on, are these students in sort of a professional or pre-professional program, is the goal to encourage creativity, or is the goal to sort of build craft? And if the goal is to encourage creativity, maybe, you know, it's useful to give some tips for like, oh, a person pursuing playwriting or visual arts, this might be the next step for them in this process, and giving them sort of one thing to hold on to grow. Whereas in sort of a more professional context, or if they're really training sort of to enter a specific field, it might look a little bit different to sort of pursue a little further of conversation about what your questions were, where you were confused, what you want to see more of next, right? Or sort of maybe what artists you think they're working in relation to. Oh, this reminded me of like this book I read. This reminded me of this, of this artist whose work I just saw in a museum, and sharing that with them. We also want to point people to the Liz Lerman critical response method, which is Liz Lerman developed it for, I think, for the dance field. Is that right, Molly? And
Yeah,
so,
that's right.
but it's been adapted to a lot of other artistic formats. It's just a series of questions that's builds a space for very structured conversation. And we see this adapted a lot in a lot of other artistic formats. That it builds from sort of this idea of giving positives, starting with, oh, what's most sticking out to you, and then moving to neutral questions. And so if you want to facilitate conversation among the students, there can be a way to sort of, we call it popcorning, like what's the first word that comes to mind, right? So then you just get this wave of responses of like excitement, adventure, sadness, scary, right? And like that can be helpful for a student to hear.
Jeremy and Molly, I have a question for you. Especially in the last, almost 20 months as we've been restricted in in-person gatherings and in-person engagements, how do you feel that giving or receiving feedback has to potentially be tailored, or the format and medium by which it's given and received might have to be taken into consideration, whether it's via email, text message, phone call, Zoom presentation, all of these things that we're dealing with in real time when we can't come together in person. Do you have any thoughts on how to determine the best medium or format for giving and receiving feedback when in person is not possible?
To me, it's dependent on the relationship. I have had conversations over email that involve feedback that I don't think are particularly incendiary, not be received the way I intended them, and create more strife than was ever intended or was even necessary. So in person, to your point, Patrick, is like, you sort of break down those barriers, and that might be the most human way to give the feedback. But that said, that there are some people who might be looking for a really concise list of thoughts, and an email might be what they respond to best. So it feels a little bit like the person receiving the feedback, like maybe the conversation of, how do you want to have this feedback is useful in terms of like mode of feedback, in so much as like the question of like what's useful for you right now is helpful for them to sort of guide the way the feedback is received. Maybe having them guide the mode of feedback sort of sets everyone up for success anyway. But I would also say that in what I've experienced in the past year and a half plus is that people's emotional sensitivity can also fluctuate from day to day. So there's a real it's been a real journey for a lot of people. So where people are right now is maybe very different than where they were a year and a half ago, or at the height of a certain like spike in COVID cases where they're located. So there's just like a real like a moment by moment kind of feeling your way through this. So it's, in my experience, just been like a handle with care kind of situation across the board. So I think the more checking in you can do with the artist, with the person receiving the feedback, the better in this moment.
Yeah, that's really well stated, Molly. I think about, it takes so long to craft email feedback. I love to be in person with people because you can sort of gauge how they're responding, of like, you can ask, do you know what I mean when I say this? And they can say no, right? And then you can rephrase. You can't do that in an email, right? They read the email and then they think it's maybe one thing and you meant another. Or you can sort of step tentatively into this area of like, oh, this might be a bombshell kind of comment, but I don't know. I don't know if they're going to be really surprised to hear this feedback or not, that my response was this to their question. And in person, you can gauge that and you can be like, okay, I know, like, I see you sort of getting a little surprised or defensive or whatever here, and I can back away and I can change tactics, and you can't do that in email. And so, yeah, just proceeding with great care and sort of building in more like all of those steps of like the check-in of like, I hope this feels okay, or I'm viewing it this way and this is responding to you because this, sort of as much context as you can provide. But even Zoom, right? You know, part of giving feedback can feel sort of intimate and fun and light in a certain way. And it's like doing that in a coffee shop can have a certain informality. Like maybe you're in a comfortable chair, but like Zoom just sort of removes a lot of the warmth. Like the warmth is just sort of absent, and sort of like people don't want to be on Zoom that long. You want to have the conversation and get off, right? And so just I think as the person giving the feedback, being just really sensitive to, there's this person on the other end who's put their, you know, heart and soul into something, and you're giving feedback to it over these not particularly personal modes of communication. And then I think from the receiving feedback end, knowing that this is not the greatest mode for clarity, and so always asking for more clarity if ever something makes you uncomfortable, right? Or feeling free to say, oh, but just that's not working for me, right? And I think any opportunity to do the mode of communication closest to face is I find usually best. Of course, for the artist, do whatever works for you, but the closer you can get, I think, to hearing the voice and seeing the face and the body language, the more you're likely to understand what the person's trying to communicate.
So I'll follow up with another question. You had mentioned comfort and discomfort a little bit there. And with anything that is a skill set, obviously, the more you practice and delve into it and use it, both receiving and giving, I think not only the better do you become at it, but the more comfortable you become in it. And do you have any, for those individuals who in their day-to-day life might not be in a role or in a situation or a setting where they're often asked to give feedback, or perhaps are in a situation to ask others to provide them with feedback? Do you have any exercises or thoughts on how to build that skill set and the comfort around opening yourself up for that vulnerability?
I love that question, Patrick, because I think you're hitting on something that is like at the root of why feedback can be awkward. And it's the fact that people don't do it all the time, or that the way that we're conditioned to tell people our opinions and to receive people's opinions isn't anything that's like structured or, you know, set up for success. It often comes from a place of like impulse, which, you know, isn't always communicated in the best way. So I mean, there are many things I'm thinking about when it comes to that. In terms of giving feedback, I'll say this. I think something that can be useful to flex that muscle is to read critical reviews and to think about yourself as a critic when you watch something that's like polished and existing for consumption. Not necessarily when you go to like your friend's art show, might not be the best place, but there are like we're all taking in so many artistic moments in our everyday lives, whether it's like, you know, the show you're binge watching or the museum you just went to, like there are, or like the mural on the street, right? Like there are so many things that exist that hit our synapses as art. And I think that as people, we like respond to that. We might be like, those colors are terrible, or, you know, like, wow, that's a bigger mural than I've ever seen before, or that's a really realistic rendering of a dog. Like we're constantly engaging with our own understanding of a piece of art. And I think there are ways that we can take those impulses and do a little mental gymnastics to try to figure out, to try to go a little bit deeper. And I think that does help flex the muscle of respondent to art, and in the conversation of how the art is landing and how the art is hitting you, and what kind of artistic connoisseur you are, for, you know, lack of a better word, because you are participating in that feedback, you know, give and take, whether it's like internal monologue and you're just responding to it yourself, or you're having like a more official conversation with the artist.
I love that. And I would add to that, maybe always trust the competence of the artist you're talking to, right? One thing I perceive sometimes from folks giving feedback who maybe don't do it for a living is that if they're not familiar with the artist, they might just assume that the artist is new. The artist is new to them, so they assume that the artist is new to their practice, right? So I think about the generosity that people put into like, oh, if you're reading your favorite mystery novelist and like you don't understand the thing that happened on the last page, you don't assume that like that novelist is a bad writer. You assume that like the work, like that maybe the work is yours. And then you go online and you're like, what did other people say about this? And you're like, oh, I missed this thing, right? But if it's an artist who's new to you, sometimes I find that the people giving feedback can assume it's the artist's work to clarify the thing. And so just the mode of sort of putting it on yourself to be like, oh, let me assume this person knows what they're doing, and give feedback from there can be such a helpful orientation. And I find just taking the time to really rehearse my notes in advance and really prepare was something that was so helpful in the early days. So if you have the time to do that, sort of like, don't take for granted that when you enter the meeting, you sort of know how to phrase things, sort of don't just know what the sort of gut response is, but like actually imagine how you will start, how you'll start the conversation, sort of how you'll start the tricky note, and sort of like how that might go. Maybe including rehearsing it with people. I don't know if that's, I think if that's at all possible, or just erring on the side of if you don't need to give feedback, sometimes don't. Like if it's a scenario, like sometimes you're like, oh, I assume that people need my feedback. Yeah, I think maybe removing the assumption that the feedback is inherently helpful can also be useful for engaging.
I think that's a really interesting response because Molly, I also heard you talk about impulse, and Jeremy, I heard you just mention like assuming that the feedback is required. So, you know, I think sometimes we have to look at solicited versus unsolicited, and what is the intent or triggering action that is delivering or stimulating the feedback. I think that that's something that, especially in a world where we all have the ability to give our opinion and feedback through social media, et cetera, asking, you know, is this actually beneficial and helpful and coming from a place of constructive criticism as opposed to destructive, and is it being solicited?
Yeah, there's a whole component of participating in feedback on someone's art that requires trust, and that's kind of antithetical to the feedback relationship that we have with social media and just like in our everyday lives. And especially when you can be so distant and there's no accountability online, you know, like we sort of live these lives where like your opinion is your opinion and it's yours to share, and we can just sort of like throw it wherever we want. And there's no consideration of how someone would be receiving that, because that's not the agreement that we've entered into when we signed up for Twitter. But when you're talking to an artist, whether it's somebody that you know really well or someone that you've just seen their work for the first time and it's a talk back, like there is an inherent level of trust there. And so it's a much more like delicate and precious relationship. And you sort of have to, whether you're the person giving the feedback or you're the artist prepared to let some of that into your brain, you're sort of like accepting that there's going to be a little bit of care given in this give and take. And I don't know that that is something that we experience in our regular lives very often.
I have a quick question. Thanks for, I jumped on a little early, or late rather. So thanks for letting me join in here. From sort of a facilitator, artist resource perspective, looking at a feedback group as a valuable tool for artists. Do you have any recommendations or thoughts on how to effectively sort of present or pose the idea of a feedback collective for artists that doesn't seem intimidating? I think often people, I'm not sure that people willingly want to jump into a feedback group, or I don't know. So that's kind of my question. What do you think? Ideas around how can we put that out into space in a way that's looked at as, like I said, not intimidating, a useful practice to engage in.
I guess my first response is that as the facilitator, I don't know if you're also sort of the, it depends. Are you brought in to facilitate sort of this group that someone else conceived, or like, or if you're part of the conception? But I think understanding, why does this group exist? This group exists maybe, and it can be any number of answers, right? We simply want to give artists in our area the resources to thrive, right? That's one kind of group. Or like, we're associated with this arts institution and we want to develop art that can go up on our gallery walls, right? And so I think articulating really clearly what your mission for the group is in advance is maybe a piece of this. And again, I'm not sure if you're saying that's a piece that you as facilitator are involved with, but then given those parameters, allowing the group of artists to decide themselves how they want to function within those parameters, right? And so maybe there's a version of that group where it's like, actually, no, we're building work that we're intending to premiere at the end of the season. So maybe you, the facilitator is also the producer and has a little more interest in the work developing in a specific way. And so then I might suggest letting people know, oh, and part of this group is at the end of every session, the producer will be involved in feedback, right? Or if it's simply about helping artists to thrive, you can be like, this is a supportive, warm environment. And then once you assemble the group of artists who want that, show up at that first session and be like, how do you want this to go, right? Like, what do you want to get a lot of feedback? Like, how do we want to do feedback? Do you want to have a standard way of doing it? Do you want to change it every time? I guess that's my first reaction. Curious, Molly, what you think?
Yeah, I was going to say something similar to the idea of warmth, because I think you're right. Like, feedback can feel alienating, or like not maybe the best thing, the best pool to jump into all the time. Especially like if you know, your vulnerability in a certain day like feels whatever. But I do think a group dynamic like that can bring so much other benefit to an artist or an artist community. So maybe the trick is to not lead with like, hey, this is about feedback, but the trick is to lead with like, hey, this is about community, camaraderie. We're all, you know, artists working the same discipline, or we're not artists working in the same discipline, and we can learn from each other's disciplines about how we operate as artists. Or we can go see a show together once a month, or go to a gallery once a month, and anybody want to be part of this group? Oh, and also there are, you know, opportunities here where people can read your new draft, or where people can respond to your work, and we'll make that available to everyone, should that be useful to you at a particular time. So like, you know, having the feedback be a central part of it, but maybe not like the most visible part of the opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah, I asked for two reasons. One, because there is a collective. I'm from Cleveland, and there is a collective in our area that has developed a feedback group. I mean, pretty much exactly what you're describing and I'm talking about. And they have seen a real drop off in engagement with artists. People are just not interested, or they don't know what it is, or like, why would I put myself into that vulnerable position with this group of people? So anything to provide to them, you know, in terms of advice, or, you know, looking at it as a tool, like I said, from an administrator's perspective and my own perspective, as a useful thing to offer to artists. So that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of a natural mode for us as dramaturgs to sort of question everything. I think a lot of you know, we come into arts organizations and there's sort of an assumption of like, oh, well, if we're having an artist group, it's going to look like this, and if we produce, it looks like that. And I think sort of Molly and I in our organizations function like, why? Like, what are we trying to do here, right? And so I don't know, that mode is just can be helpful. It sort of slows processes down sometimes, but in a useful way, to be like, what's really the thing we're trying to do here, and how can we be as open as possible to the best way to do it? I see there's a question from Vanessa in the chat about favorite alternative ways of giving feedback other than talking. I like that question. Molly?
wish I had a better answer for that because this is such a good question, and now I want to have an answer for this. So I'm about to explore this in my own relationships with artists. I think, okay, so the way that I want to answer this isn't 100% what Vanessa is, I think, asking, because it does involve talking, but I think there's real value in being able to connect with an artist before you give them feedback. So like, if you can, you know, go out with them for a coffee and talk about like a show that you've both seen that you really loved, or if, you know, you can come together on like some TV show or some book that you've both read, or, you know, like the crappy weather, or like if there's a way to connect that isn't about the work, a lot of times you can like sneak in threads that feel useful about the work, but that aren't necessarily quite as like dry and didactic as like a feedback session might become. But that doesn't really answer your question.
I see now a follow-up in the chat.
So interesting.
I'm not sure if you're seeing this, that Vanessa's, for example, said they've tried asking audience to do drawings of their responses, like in a talkback. I love this idea of opening up options so people can give feedback in the way they want to, right? I think asking for feedback in a way where it's like, right, not everyone's going to want to draw, maybe, but not everyone's going to want to talk. And so if there's some way to leave it open-ended for people to respond in the way they, right? So like some people might feel comfortable speaking up in a large group. Some people might prefer to like sit with it and respond later, right? So is there an opportunity for, is there an email address or like, or for someone to email where they could write out, someone might want to write out their thoughts and think about it, or like, I'd love the idea of expanding the opportunities. I also think anything that, you know, involves talking, but talking and not sitting. So like if you can relocate an audience to a new space from where they saw the arts, or if it's a one-on-one conversation, like simply talking and walking, talking in nature, talking outdoors versus inside, like the change in environment and sort of in mode can be really, can activate different kinds of conversation and response. There's different stimuli around. Sometimes you're distracting yourself from the conversation by doing other things simultaneously, and that can sort of put people at ease and open up new things. If we're not answering your question, Vanessa, feel free to keep clarifying or asking follow-ups, but because it's an interesting one. Oh, great.
We are a little after 7 o'clock, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Do we have any final questions for Jeremy and Molly while we have them? I also included in the chat function, I did share a link to the document that Beehive Dramaturgy put together on giving and receiving feedback, which I think is just an absolutely fantastic resource. I'm so glad that it not only exists online, but it's open source and can be accessed and used and reflected on. It really is a fantastic tool. And I know that once I received it, I shared it with the Erie Arts and Culture team, because even though you're talking about artists, I think that anytime you're working in a team dynamic, this type of information is really helpful. And I think about, you know, team dynamics and board engagement and all of these other things that oftentimes we're expected to give feedback, but we're not necessarily equipped or structured, or again, as you both had indicated at multiple points in this Q&A, it's not something that we always have the opportunity to do in our day-to-day life. So sometimes it can be uncomfortable or awkward. And yeah, so I'm really appreciative of both your time and insights this evening, but also for the fact that you all had the leadership and vision to share that document on your website. So thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. We're glad that you found it, and we're glad that you've used it for the organization, and we're happy for the opportunity to come and talk about it.
Yeah, thanks for having us tonight. It's great to be able to talk about this topic.
And for those that are here this evening, this will exist on Erie Arts and Culture's Facebook after this evening session closes. Additionally, we will do a recap blog on our website where we will include the video. We'll also include a link to the document that I shared in the chat function. And we'll also include a link to Liz Lerman's site for the critical response process, since you referenced that in this evening's conversation. So thank you all so much. And if you were in attendance, we hope you can share this with others in your artistic and creative networks in hopes that it might build stronger bonds and benefit our creative communities across North America and beyond. So again, Jeremy and Molly, thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good night. Happy
Patrick.
collaborating.
Yeah, have a good one.